You know, after our last conversation, I was thinking it's so crazy. It just feels crazy to me that fat can be metabolized to create glucose.
Right.
But if you actually look at the chemical structure, it's not that crazy.
Right.
Fat molecules have this glycerol head and the fatty acid tails, and all these things are largely carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and that's what we're making our glucose and our glycogen out of. And it's also a little clearer to me now that glycogen is just a long chain of glucose molecules.
Long chain that is more efficient or more ready for ATP generation than long chains of fat.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
So I would love to talk a little bit about fat. So one of the things that we discussed last time was that if you eat more fat than your body can utilize for fuel, what happens to that fat? So once your glycogen stores are filled up,
yes.
What happens to the rest of that fat?
It depends what other macronutrients you have in the scenario. So if you have are you basically saying what happens when you have a surplus of calories and those calories are coming from fat?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
If you have a surplus of calories and you have protein, fat, and carbohydrates recently eaten, ready to be used, you will most likely store most of the carbohydrate that you're eating as fat. And while you're doing that, burn fat and the circulating glucose that you already had.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And once you get to the end of that line, you may well go ahead and repackage some fat as well into your body fat. Be further away from the subject, or it might be closer. A lot of people have the fear of fat driving up their cholesterol.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fine. They should have a fear of excess calories in the presence of carbohydrates, potentially making their cholesterol bad. So they're not wrong for worrying about the excess calories. But I think we talked about in the last podcast how cholesterol, like that goes in our veins and arteries, tends to be metabolized by the liver. That's one stage of the process from carbohydrates. But so what that means is that if somebody is eating an excess of food, protein, fat, and carbohydrates, and their cholesterol is negatively affected by that, it wasn't that the fat that they were eating translated into lining the veins and arteries with plaque. It was actually the carbohydrates. However, that person could have avoided that change of cholesterol numbers. We're not talking about body fat. We're not talking about insulin. They could have avoided that change by reducing the calories via fat or carbohydrate.
So this issue is only going to arise when there's a caloric surplus.
Yes,
they've eaten more calories than they can burn. At that point, the presence of carbohydrates could negatively impact their cholesterol or raise their cholesterol.
Yes. So because, let's say, there were plenty of calories from fat, that meant that there was extra resource for the body as far as carbohydrates to go ahead and make some more cholesterol. And because of the inflammation associated with chronic blood sugar issues and so on and so forth, in that given person, it was a good idea to go ahead and patch up the veins and arteries with cholesterol, which is what you're basically doing when you're talking about clogged arteries. It's a lot of patching from chronic inflammation.
Interesting. Okay. Let me ask a similar related question. What is so what is the dietary fat trajectory? Is it dependent on, is the trajectory of dietary fat different if it's unsaturated or saturated? We talked about this a little bit last time. My basic understanding is that unsaturated fat is preferential for maybe joint or nerve tissue repair, whereas saturated fat is preferential for fuel source, as a fuel source.
Yes.
Okay. And does this change the trajectory of, when you ingest those fat molecules, does it change how they travel through your body depending on whether they're saturated or unsaturated? You know, we've kind of just said that they have different destinations ultimately. At what point do they diverge?
Great question. As soon as they get unpacked.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some relative divergence, like once stuff is moving through the intestines, but then once all those chemicals get into the lymph system, depending on what pieces are needed, right? So we've got all those carbon bonds on the long chains of saturated fat, and on the unsaturated chains, there are pieces of that chemical structure that don't need to be unpackaged further, and then they can go, say, bind to a receptor site of the knee joint, and from there modulate inflammatory processes. So that's something that EPA, omega-3. Check something real quick.
Yeah. Is it going to scramble your brain if I ask you a question while you're double checking?
Not at all.
It sounds like you associate carbohydrate intake with inflammation more than you associate fat intake with inflammation.
Yes.
And it doesn't matter if it's saturated or unsaturated.
Yes. So let's take the knee. Omega-6s can bind to receptors in the knee joint. And by binding to those receptors, they call these things called eicosanoids, which are inflammatory mediators. So these chemicals that basically bring arthritis, they call those guys to the knee. And they call it an inflammatory cascade. Occurs from there, where one aspect of inflammation modulation leads to another, and you start with, relative pain, like I got an achy knee, and that eventually ends up being like osseous structure, arthritis. Like if that same receptor in the knee gets EPA, omega-3 fat, it signals a repair process, which is anti-inflammatory by nature. The reason that inflammation is important is it's an aspect of the immune system and the healing process. So when you're sick, or let's just say you're lifting weights, you're going to destroy the muscle as best you can without severing your tendons and causing the muscle to completely rip apart. But you're causing a lot of micro trauma, tears in that muscle, which creates inflammation. And that inflammation is a signal to the body to go repair it in a more stable, with more stability than it had before. I.e., you'll volumize the muscle, or you might grow some new muscle fibers. You're not. Yes.
Let's just. I totally follow that with the muscles. That is definitely a huge part of exercise, is you're literally breaking your body.
Yes.
But let's stick to the knee joint. And the omega-6, that's bonded to the receptor, and the eicosanoids are coming. We've got a little bit of an inflammatory cascade happening.
Yes.
How does your body fortify against that happening in the future?
It doesn't really. It's kind of dictated. It's something that you can control. So depending on what you eat and what you do, you will either warrant continued inflammation or normal maintenance and structure of the knee.
So if I continue to eat omega-6s, my inflammation is going to continue to progress. And if
that depends on how much carbohydrate you take in and if you are eating a sufficient amount of omega-3s.
So if I'm eating an insufficient amount of omega-3s and I have a lot of omega-6 on board,
you'll be upregulating inflammation.
And where do carbohydrates play into that? Do I want more? So let's say that I want to get really inflamed. I want to inflame my knee. I want to keep on pushing inflammation in that direction. I'm going to eat a lot of omega-6. And do I want more carbohydrates to help me stay inflamed, or do I want fewer? Yes.
Yeah, you want to constantly have too many carbohydrates, so you're constantly making that cortisol kick in, and you'll just run yourself into the ground.
Now, if I want to flip the coin, I want to go the other way, then I want to decrease my omega-6 intake. I want to get some EPA on board, and I want to start limiting my carbohydrates. And the reason that I'm fluctuating my carbohydrates is I'm trying to
metabolize more of the omega-6s for energy.
Oh, so if I have fewer carbohydrates on board, then I can metabolize the omega-6 for energy?
Yes. The body would prefer to metabolize that omega-6 compared to an animal-based omega-3 fat like EPA and DHA. ALA not necessarily the case, which is plant-based omega-3.
Is omega-6 generally animal fat based?
No.
How am I going to get some omega-6? What are some common
animal? So omega-6s are the bases of grains. And grains themselves, like in their raw form, don't have a lot of fat, right? Like you might have just ground wheat, and in half a cup there might be a total fat amount of 1 gram, maybe 2 grams. The majority of that's going to be omega-6. But what happens is 2 routes. One is directly to the human. Most mass-produced foods have vegetable oil in them. Vegetable oil is code for corn, soy,
sunflower, safflower, soybean oil. Yeah.
And those are all omega-6. So 1 tablespoon of vegetable oil, I believe, is like 12 grams of fat. And it's all potentially inflammatory. And most people eat way more than just a tablespoon of vegetable oil a day. So that's how they're concentrating that. And that's why it's much better to use olive oil and butter and coconut oil, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And the other avenue is through commercial livestock and factory farming, which is also now extended into farmed fisheries, where they're feeding these animals meal that is grain-based, which they would never normally be eating out in the wild. And so rather than just my favorite is the cow, because that's pretty much my favorite food is grass-fed beef. But instead of foraging and eating a lot of little bugs and eating a lot of grass, which is rich in omega-3s, which they're able to convert into animal-sourced omega-3s that are essential for us, instead of doing that, they just eat corn and soy. And so they become marbled with inflammatory fat.
All those poor cows.
And then we eat that. And then, like, I have never seen Wagyu, and none of that is grass-fed. And people are really enjoying it. It tastes good. But that's like an atomic bomb of inflammation. And those animals were not very healthy during their life. They were morbidly obese. They didn't feel good. So those are the 2 ways that we generally get way too much omega-6. And that's why you can have a profound effect on the ratio of omega-6 to 3 by altering the sources of protein that you purchase or prepare or hunt.
Mm-hmm. And if we can get more if we can get more omega-3s on board and reduce our carbohydrate intake, we're going to feel less inflamed. And
there's more calories that can be like we can use more of the excess fats that aren't essential for us for energy production.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not necessarily like the way everyone should eat or the way people are going to be happiest eating, but in terms of a real anti-inflammatory diet, that's a part of the puzzle. That's how you actually do that.
Limited carbohydrates and healthier fats.
Yeah, you focus on keeping inflammatory fats low and giving yourself an opportunity to metabolize those for energy as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. I think I follow you there. I think I got you.
So if you're eating all of those fats and you're eating a bunch of carbohydrates, then you're almost forcing your body to absorb the omega-6s and put them in places that are going to cause problems down the road.
Mm-hmm. This is related to something that I'm going to ask you about in a couple of minutes, but because it seems to me from our last conversation that the role of insulin is to help ferry nutrients and I'll just say nutrients into the cell. Like,
yes,
insulin is a carrier, right? So it's gonna focus on glucose molecules. It's also gonna pick up amino acids, and it's gonna help them get into the cell. And that's why the ketogenic diet makes more and more sense, or eating even with like a ketogenic flavor to your palate makes more sense now, because that's basically sending a signal to your body that differentiates between what food is used as fuel and what food is used for tissue repair and growth.
And then for people with problems, sometimes it makes more sense to do more of that.
Yeah, for sure. Patrick, last time we talked, you compared saturated fat to diesel fuel.
Yes.
And I wasn't sure if you were, first of all, what do you think of when you think of diesel fuel? I don't know enough about engines to understand the comparison.
Sure. So a diesel engine, because of the way the pistons fire, it's less volatile, meaning the engines can take a lot more wear and tear,
mm-hmm.
which is a big reason why 18-wheelers and dually trucks have historically always been diesel,
mm-hmm.
so that those engines can get a million miles, can get a lot of miles on them.
Yeah.
And the combustion of diesel fuel also lends itself to creating more torque. And the reason that is valuable in that world, and I grew up working in a lot of shipyards and stuff like that, is that you are often carrying very heavy loads
mm-hmm.
and moving them around. And you're often moving them around not great distances. For instance, you might be moving containers around an acre shipyard and be lining them up and stacking them so that they all fit well. And you need to be able to really control that 6 inches to a foot. So in an engine with a lot of torque, you can take a heavy load and get it moving from zero, from a full stop, very much more effectively than you can with low torque.
Mm-hmm.
And it has nothing to do with top speed, and it has nothing to do with acceleration at a certain point.
Mm-hmm.
But from a dead stop, torque is often going to determine that acceleration. So when I think about diesel fuel, I think of vehicles built for longevity, not 0 to 60.
Mm-hmm.
with the ability to work all day.
Yeah.
These engines that can run 1,000,000 miles, sometimes they don't really hit the highway for that many miles, but they'll run all day to keep a work crew, to keep the heater running, which is why Elon Musk is going to be transforming the work vehicle scene when that Tesla truck comes out. It's going to have solar panels on the bed. So rather than have a combustion engine running all day, they can run heating and cooling and compressors and all of that stuff just with sunlight. But anyway, those diesel trucks will need to run all day. And the last thing you want is one to break down or one to not be able to handle the force under a load in the middle of nowhere where you've been working all day and just want to get off the site safely.
And we don't normally associate diesel engines with a lot of acceleration.
Exactly.
Or
not a lot of
super high
horsepower
speed
necessarily. Right.
So when you were making that comparison, you were saying that saturated fat is more of like a slow burning fuel.
Yes. And using the comparison of a high horsepower turbocharged high octane gasoline engine, using that as a metaphor for carbohydrates, you can do a lot less damage to your system running diesel fuel. You can get a lot more mileage on running diesel, on burning fat, than you can having a carbohydrate diet, especially a low-fat carbohydrate diet, because of the damage that you're going to do to your insulin system.
Right. Got
over
it.
time.
Right.
And you might feel your best. In fact, I tend to feel my best eating some carbohydrates within my diet.
Yeah. Well, this is one of many. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, this is one of like many segues that we could make into differentiating between longevity and performance, right? Because if we don't have any carbohydrates on board, sometimes you need to go 0 to 60 in 2.5 seconds. Like sometimes you need to be able to put a lot of force into an effort, some kind of athletic endeavor. And saturated fat's not necessarily going to support that. But if you're constantly running on that 0 to 60 system, you're not necessarily going to last a very long time.
Perfectly said. The hysterics will have, because keto style eating became popular in the last decade. It's been around for a long time before that, but you hear people trying to make it the one size fits all, just like folks do with everything. Yeah. So you'll hear arguments that, oh, well, once you're keto adapted, like I noticed no difference in my performance. And from a biochemistry standpoint, that's neat if that works for you, but that doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But what does make a lot of sense is that, as you said a few minutes ago, eating a restricted carbohydrate diet or a higher fat diet for certain periods of time can have certain very tangible positive consequences for somebody. There are a lot of things that it definitely does do. I think that people will probably have their best luck with eating and everything health related if they act in appreciation of understanding that nothing does longevity and performance. There's no size fits all, and that's okay.
It's actually beautiful once you understand that that's how you need to be playing the game. That you need to be, you need to be I don't know if cycling is the right word, but you need to be sometimes putting your energy and your efforts into a longevity pursuit, and other times into performance. And maybe cycling is the right word. You need to have some balance there and go back and forth between the two, because what's longevity without performance, right? You live forever, but you can't do anything. What's the point of that?
Pretty boring, right?
Yeah. No, we want to have fun. We want to enjoy life. So we got to make sure that we can have some strong performances, but also we want to be able to have those strong performances for a very long time.
It's almost like it's programmed into the game if you play it right.
Having to take breaks and go in cycles and seasons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Being really serious, needing to take a break to sustain that.
Yeah. Oh my God. How many times have I told a client that you don't get stronger in the gym. You get stronger when you recover from being in the gym. And personally, I've absolutely struggled with that element of, training and performance and this balance. And like, I'll just train too much. I'll run myself right into the ground. I won't take that time to recover.
Why do you find yourself saying that to clients? What pattern is it that you see them in when you're like, all right, I gotta give this person the cliche. They've earned it.
They've earned the cliche. Because I want to make sure that they are prioritizing rest and recovery. And at the end of the workout, if you come into the gym and you work out for an hour, at the end of that workout, you should be depleted. And if you're not doing the appropriate things to replenish yourself, then you're not going to receive the benefit of your efforts.
Of that work.
Yeah. And that's kind of tragic because you'll have somebody, they put a lot of effort into going to the gym. They put a lot of effort into how hard they worked while they were there. And then they don't understand good practices when it comes to resting. And so they might eat, a lot of carbohydrates and maybe some omega-6, and then they might not sleep. They might just sit in a sedentary position for a very, very long time. And so they got to recover properly. You got to make sure they get some good sleep, eat some good foods, rest.
So do you have a lot of clients who, or historically, have you had a lot of clients who come in and they clearly think a lot of you and they just put it all in that hour, and then you see that not translate at all to once they're not in front of you? And they drop off the program when they're on their own time?
I see people drop off when they're on their own. It's interesting, like the people that work the hardest with me are also working hard when I'm not around. Like that's their mode. You know what I mean? Like
that's the kind of person you attract, you'd say?
That's the kind of person that they are. I definitely train people on both ends of that spectrum, and I always have. I've trained people that they're already fit, they're already obsessed with exercise, and if anything, those are the people that I particularly need to say, hey, like, you can't train at this intensity 7 days a week. Like, you will actually do better if you rest more. And then I also have the clients who they're going to go off the rails in the other direction because they're going to work out with me for 1 to 3 hours a week, and they're not going to do anything in the interim when they're not with me. And those people, when they're working out with me for that hour, it's pretty atypical for those people that don't exercise on their own to work super hard in that hour that they're with me. And so then for them, I mean, I could try and crack the whip, but what I usually try and do instead is try to have them associate movement with a positive experience. And so I try to make exercise something that's, challenging but doable, something that's fun, something that doesn't feel terrible for their body. That's usually my goal for them. But every now and then I'll get the clients, like you said, who just go so hard when we're together, and it's like they're trying to make up for lost time. And in some ways, those are like the most tragic cases, because if we could just take that effort and spend it a little differently, I think they would see some more results,
Are the people that spend an hour to 3 hours with you a week, and that's all they do, what are they looking for? Are they looking for someone to show them that exercise can be fun or empowering? Is it a guilt thing, or they just want to have fun? What brings them there? Because it can't really be results, right? Or is it?
It's sometimes it's penance, like a little self-flagellation. They're like, I know that I'm being shitty to my body every day, and I want this trainer to like beat me up so I can, feel a little bit better. So some of it's guilt. And yeah, that's certainly part of it. And then others, I've actually had good experience with clients who have just come to a place of acceptance. Like they accept that they're going to be sedentary and that their health is going to backtrack, but they figure that seeing me is better than nothing. And I say, I will always encourage to do more. Yeah, I'll always encourage to do more. I mean, it's a little sad for me as the years go on and I see that they're capable of less over time. But I know that they'd be in a worse spot if I hadn't been seeing them a couple times a week. So I think if they have the information and they're making an informed decision, then I got to respect who they are as adults and let them live that life. But I will always be trying to provide that information in a positive way. And hey, but you just try and support people wherever you got to support people where they're at. You can't force them to be somewhere they're not. That's okay.
No, because they're exactly where they're supposed to be.
Yeah. And the more, and yep. And everybody has a superpower. At some point, no matter who I'm training, I always find that every human body is capable of something that other human bodies aren't capable of. And that doesn't matter if they're sedentary or not. Like, it's really cool. Like, at some point, no matter who I'm training, I'm going to find something that they can do better than I can. And I exercise all the time. Yeah, it's great.
You hear that, listeners out there? If you're sitting there and somebody said that, well, you're just not athletic.
No, you got something.
You've got a superpower.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you, some of the people that I have seen that you'd think were not athletic had just never cultivated that. And the moment they start putting pieces together, they're athletic.
Yeah. Oh, everybody's got something. And some people, they have a lot of things. And some people are gifted. All right. So bringing it back to diet for a moment, basically, and this is a cultural bias here, but the name of the game here is we're trying to get a body that burns fat and builds muscle. There's cultural bias there, and
yes,
but that is what it is.
So do you mean that our culture says that that's what a healthy state is?
Exactly. And I'm not trying to get into whether or not that state is health. Yeah, is I'm not saying that's good for longevity or performance. That's what America says. Yeah, we say that we want to burn fat and build muscle.
America basically says you should look like Rambo if you're healthy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what I thought would be interesting to look at, if that's the name of the game, is to figure out what kind of states promote building muscle and burning fat. Maybe it would actually be helpful to look at how can we do the opposite? Like, what kind of states create fat and help us lose muscle?
Eat sugar all day and don't bear weight.
So I need to go into space. I need to eat a high carbohydrate, low protein, low fat diet.
Yes. The less protein you eat, the more you'll be unable to support your muscle, musculoskeletal system. And in order for your body to create nutrients it's not getting, because there's very little nutrition in carbohydrates. Most nutrition is within fat and protein containing foods. Your body will start leaching amino acids out of your muscles. So that'll speed up the muscle, the catabolism. Did I say that right?
Catabolize. Yeah.
Catabolize. And the lack of fat will force the body to kind of create a stream of burning whatever little bit it needs for energy, and then just packaging all that carbohydrate into body fat.
Mm-hmm. So is cortisol considered a catabolic hormone?
Yes.
So when you have a lot of cortisol on board, your body is trying to come back to homeostasis.
Yes. Usually been traumatized.
Yeah. You having some kind of stressor. How does your body do that? How does it lower your cortisol levels? I guess I'm asking what the mechanism is.
So there are there are multiple mechanisms, but one, you can force it through the insulin system.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing you can do is create a fight or flight reaction. And that's the subsequent cortisol release after the fact. Is how your body's going to try to return you to that homeostasis. So take an evolutionary example, and we're running around in the jungle, and all of a sudden we see a lion.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, oh shit, I got to get away from this lion. So you start running. The lion's kind of chasing you, start getting tired. And then all of a sudden the lion starts getting a little closer to you and you run up a tree as quickly as you can. And the lion's kind of going up after, and you see those big claws and he's going to get you. And he hits a branch and the branch snaps and he falls to the ground and he can't quite get up onto the tree. And you spend the next 4 hours hanging onto this branch in the middle of the jungle with everything flying around you, watching this big cat stalk you from every other tree to see if it can get around, until finally it's been dark for several hours and you hear it walk off. And it's silent for the first time during the entire day.
Mm-hmm.
And what you don't realize is that your body has been fueling itself off of your body fat for the last 4 hours. Your pupils have been constricted. Your skin capillaries have been acting in specific ways, all priming your body to sense any danger and react very quickly to it, which is exhausting for your body. You're also going to be increasing the tensile strength of your ligaments and tendons, so you can be more explosive than you naturally could be. You were going to say?
I was going to say that your digestive system is downregulated.
Mm-hmm. Bingo. And so once you finally realize that danger is over, the body is going to start secreting cortisol to bring you down. Hopefully drive you to sleep as quickly as possible. Because that's when you're going to have your major secretions of testosterone and growth hormone, recovery hormones. And you're going to be able to, defragment your hard drive, which is your brain, clear your thoughts, get ready for the next day, and be ready, be recharged in the most effective way. The best way, you touched on it a little bit earlier, mentioning that some of your clients, they have a history of not sleeping. Your best way to recover is sleep, as long as you have some sufficient nutrients in you. And so the cortisol response will happen as a way to help get you to sleep, help bring you down. And that's one of the reasons why I tend to often, it all depends on what I'm doing, but very often I will load my carbohydrates near the end of my day, especially into my last meal. So that can help me drive myself into a deeper sleep more quickly and increase the amount of growth hormone that I can secrete, which doesn't really kick in until you're in a deep sleep.
And this is because you have flooded your bloodstream with glucose molecules. And
I give it too much insulin.
You got too much insulin.
Too much glucose.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I cause a big surge of insulin, and then I get some cortisol in the back end. And when I'm doing that, I'm I've had a few extra pounds on me sometime in the last couple of years, but I'm typically at like a calorie or a carbohydrate deficit when I go to do that. So it's not like I'm just adding body fat. Like I'm lean. I can do that, and I'm just purposely overeating that macronutrient a little bit. Well, it's not overeating. I'm doing it on purpose.
Right. Well, you're depleted because you just ran up a tree and got chased by a tiger for 4 hours, right?
Right.
You used up all your stores, and that's why, that's why you're depleted in that moment.
Yes, from an evolutionary perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why it was really practical. I mean, there's a lot of nuance to how it keeps your body working day in and day out, but that's an obvious or a major method by which it kind of enters our life.
Mm-hmm.
It's the come down.
Cortisol helps you come down. So cortisol is going to help me come out of a flight or a sympathetic nervous system state.
Yeah, it'll put you into a relative fog.
Mm-hmm.
Food coma, as they say.
So cortisol is responsible for that. Yeah. And we're considered, so cortisol is that a catabolic hormone?
Yeah.
When I think, okay. Now,
because it's going to go ahead and get rid of anything. So like if you go to sleep after that day of running from the lion and starvation, it's going to tear your muscles apart to repair anything that's damaged.
Mm-hmm. Cortisol will. But if you're in the tree and you have...
Going to also hold on to body fat such that you can retain fuel for if you've got to go be stressed out again.
But it's just diesel fuel, right?
What is?
The body fat. If I'm using my body fat, that's not really going to get me from 0 to 60 the same way that the glycogen stores will.
But if you have nothing to eat because you're stuck in a tree, that's where your energy's coming from.
Is it coming from fat store? Are my glycogen stores being refueled by my body fat at that point?
With certain pathways, yes, and others, no.
Yeah.
So like you're always creating ketone bodies to fuel your heart,
mm-hmm.
and you're always creating some glucose to fuel your brain and your liver,
mm-hmm.
even when you're in ketosis.
Interesting.
Yeah. So if you just have nothing, then you're going to have to leach amino acids, typically
mm-hmm.
from your musculoskeletal system, and then you'll have to leach the building blocks for the energy.
So
your body fat.
Let's go back to this performance moment again, where we're frantically trying to escape from this tiger. At that point, during the performance, it seems like from what we're talking about, that neither cortisol nor insulin is really going to be a major player in my hormonal system or my hormonal landscape at that
time. As long
time.
as you're being tough and not wimping out.
What do you mean?
Well, if you start coming out of that fight or flight response, then you're gonna have a subsequent endocrine consequence.
Mm-hmm.
So the cortisol will start to show up. It acts independently of food. Food's just one pathway where it gets involved. So it's its own guy.
Yeah.
But yeah. If you start wimping out, then you're probably going to get eaten, but you'll also have some cortisol show up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what other hormones are at play during those fight or flight moments?
All of them. All of our hormones are always at play.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. They're kind of, in a lot of ways, they're partial precursors to our neurotransmitter responses.
Mm-hmm. I guess where I'm having some confusion here is I'm trying to break the body's states. I'm trying to differentiate between these anabolic and catabolic states. And yes. I'm trying to have my catabolic states be my performance states and my anabolic states be my recovery states. And all that is going fine until I find out that cortisol is catabolic, meaning that and when I think catabolic, I would think that needs to be a performance state because my body tissues need to be like I'm trying to use what my body has at that point. I'm not trying to recover. I'm trying to perform. And so that's how I think of a catabolic state. And then an anabolic state, I think of as the rebuilding phase.
Well, the entire process of running from the lion was catabolic just by default of the calorie expenditure.
Agreed.
So independent of any hormones, the activity was catabolic.
Mm-hmm. So this seems problematic to have at the end of a catabolic moment, a catabolic activity, to then have a catabolic hormone come in afterward.
Yeah, it sucks to be chased by lions. It's not, and that's something, it's funny, but it also is something that we forget when we're looking at human health. Like, we're designed to deal with real shit.
Mm-hmm.
And so the stimulus that we give ourselves most of the time it's not a real stimulus, right? Like a lot of us don't feel real fear. And of course, the body needs a scale. So we start to see hypersensitivity and anxiety disorders and stuff like that from being late for a conference call.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a coping mechanism for maintaining homeostasis, right?
Right.
But when people were causing stress responses, it wasn't because they did a squat. It was because they had something trying to rip them apart.
Mm-hmm.
And that gets lost in the sauce quite often when people are looking at like what they're doing to their bodies and what they need to do to their body to support that activity.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's pretty easy to remain anabolic in today's day and age as far as protein synthesis and making muscle. There aren't really a whole lot of things showing up that can take us out of that.
Right. Although we probably had quite a few more people stay in a catabolic state throughout the course of this pandemic, just due to the stress, emotional stress,
Yes.
mental stress.
Ironically, we probably have more people walking around in relative catabolic states than ever before on this planet because people do so little. Even though it's so easy to not. Like there are all these tools to remain relatively anabolic.
Right.
But also, when we throw around the term anabolic, what we're really talking about is like a growth phenomenon at a cellular level.
Mm-hmm. Tell me more. This is what I need to understand.
Well, if somebody is just anabolic all the time, right, then they eventually would be 500 pounds of pure muscle.
They got to be huge.
Right. They would just keep on growing.
But they're not fat, right? Or would they also, I mean, couldn't you, if you're in an anabolic state all the time, why could you not also just be obese?
You could, especially if you supported that state by constantly eating a surplus of calories.
Carbohydrate, predominantly.
But as we touched on, if we're talking about muscle, if somebody's trying to be as big as they possibly could, they're probably going to be using carbohydrates as a tool for that to manipulate their insulin system. Mm-hmm. And that, as a consequence, that'll usually result in some body fat deposition. Staying with that bodybuilder example, though, they do a lot of things to keep themselves in a relative muscle building and muscle preserving state, even when they start reducing their calories. And the whole name of their game is to keep those cortisol levels and keep that stress response really, really low as they continue to manipulate their physiology towards something someone would think of as anabolic. But it's not that they're growing, they're just keeping a lot of those pathway signals on such that the body holds onto that muscle, where under normal circumstances, the body would be getting rid of that stuff really quick. It's heavy, it's full of good nutrition for other processes, and organ systems, start to suffer as a consequence, especially when you're in like starvation mode.
Yeah. Interesting. Does having elevated cortisol have an effect on your appetite?
Yes.
Which direction?
Makes most people hungrier. Has an effect on your energy. Reduces your energy. Has an effect on your thought processes. Quite often, kind of blunts mental clarity. But of course, that's relative to somebody's mental state, because if they're always high strung, then doing something to chill them out a little bit can open a window for them to be paying attention a little bit better, and that might work out better. But if somebody's
Patrick.
Right, but if somebody's usually zeroed in, thinking clearly, then that can interrupt their clarity.
Mm-hmm. We touched on a little bit how, speaking of mental states, we touched on how sugar crashes happen to people because they, either due to a high carbohydrate diet, regularly having too many carbohydrates in their body, their goblet cells are kind of working overtime. So they get too much insulin released, and then all of a sudden there's not enough glucose in their bloodstream, so they have this sugar crash. And I'm curious, so do diabetics or people that have worn out those goblet cells in the pancreas, are they, and they're also reliant on exogenous insulin, do they not experience sugar crashes as regularly?
It depends how they do it.
Yeah?
Yeah, so there's fast-acting and long-acting insulin.
Mm-hmm.
And those behave differently. Short-acting insulin needs to be done right around the meal and typically needs to be more exact to the amount of carbohydrates that are being eaten.
Wow.
And especially newer forms of long-acting insulin, you can kind of take earlier in the day and it will maintain your ability to process carbohydrates for, I think it's like maybe 6 or 8 hours, something like that.
So what would happen if you had all that insulin?
As long as you stay within certain ranges.
Yeah. What would happen if you had that long-acting insulin on board and then you didn't eat any carbs all day?
You cause yourself problems.
Yeah. Tell me more. What kind of problems?
You typically go hypo, pass out and die.
Hypoglycemic.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, because I've got too much
the
insulin on board.
that's circulating just takes it all out.
Yeah.
And why diabetics always have to have some candy bars in their purse.
Because they're using insulin and it's not necessarily regulated by their body.
And people make mistakes,
proportion.
like they read the like 1 cc and they do like a couple of milliliter. Maybe they, for some reason, they got needles that are from a different standard, literally.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe they're UK needles or something like that. They're trying to save money because it's so expensive in the US, and then they take double the dose they should have, or they forget, or they forgot earlier. So they're like, well, I'll just go ahead and take this now, and then I'll eat the moment that we get to the theater. And then they get stuck in line, and then they forget.
God. Yeah. Wow. So yeah, that kind of answers my follow-up question. I was going to say, so they never have too much insulin, but the glucose levels, if they didn't take that exogenous insulin and they don't create enough insulin on their own and they have too much glucose in their blood,
fat.
What happens then? They just get fat?
They just are a fat diabetic. And that's what most of people we see in this country with diabetes are. They're obese. They just use insulin essentially as an enabler to continue eating too many carbohydrates. They just will eat how many carbs they want, and they'll just dose their insulin accordingly.
Wow. So if I have too many carbs in my blood and I'm not producing enough insulin to ferry those carbohydrates where they need to go, then they get
blood sugar starts creeping up.
Yeah.
You start to have like a 130, 150 blood sugar, glucose level within your blood, and it starts becoming toxic.
Wow.
And that's when you see like diabetic neuropathy.
Right. We touched on this last time.
But hands, legs that will get amputated, and they lose their circulation. They first lose their nerve function because that's the deepest tissue. It goes from the inside out in terms of destroying things. So they lose that nerve innervation, and that causes the circulation to not work properly. And then they rot their veins and arteries, and then that causes the tissue not to be able to be maintained. And then the limb is done.
And then they're too acidic. Their pH is too low.
Exactly, sir.
It makes much more sense this time around.
Yes. So you can either get fat, you can lose your limbs, or you can just do the right thing and get healthy.
Yeah. And carbohydrates, fascinating molecule.
Yeah, it's curious to me that they're so powerful, and yet there's such a lack of education on this stuff. Like the only way you can get diabetes is by eating carbohydrates. But you wouldn't believe how many diabetics I've spoken to that no one had ever explained that to them. And we could fix an epidemic in this country just like that, and people could change their lives. And they still might be a little obese because they might just like eating a lot of calories. But we could eliminate like a huge problem for people if they would just be more conscious of their carbohydrates. And that's okay. There are plenty of reasons why people eat too many carbohydrates. But it's curious to me that it just escapes us as a society up to this point.
Yeah, it hasn't escaped the industry interest.
No, keto's huge, right?
No, I'm talking about the carbohydrates being manufactured into the refined carbohydrates that are packaged with those, seed
And
oils.
it doesn't seem to hurt
vegetable
their
and seed oils.
business much either, does it?
Oh, what? That everybody's health is crumbling?
That it's pretty easy to understand how they cause problems if you have somebody just explain a little science to you. That doesn't seem to make any difference in the profit margins.
Right. Well, I think, I don't know, maybe I'm being like a paranoid or a conspiracy theorist, but I believe that the sugar industry and look, we have 330 million people in this country. Feeding that many people is tough.
It's a task.
And it's been done. Everybody's fed. Okay. So, hey, my hat's off to all of our food producers. They are keeping us fed, and that's not a small feat by any stretch of the imagination. And at the same time, the proliferation of high carbohydrate foods that are processed with these vegetable and seed oils, there are these inflammation bombs that are highly addictive. We talked last time about how they access the
opiate receptors.
Thank you, sir. Accesses that part of our brain, and the education is not there for people to understand how problematic this kind of eating is, and people get addicted. Oh my God,
exactly.
So addictive.
Exactly.
And so, hey man, everybody has. I think addiction is very much a part of the human experience, but
right.
At least with certain addictions, you understand that you're addicted, and then you can manage it. With drugs, if you drink alcohol, that's an addictive substance. You can maybe regulate that a little bit. You can proceed with caution. But if you've been eating sugary cereal your entire life, how would you ever develop the skills, the ability to modify and regulate that?
It's not straightforward.
No. Hey, I'll get pretty heated if we keep talking about it, because it's almost like our biology has been hacked by these industry interests that, and I don't want to vilify people. Some people deserve it, but the real issue here are the mechanisms in place, because as a corporation, you're legally obligated to make a profit for your shareholders. And so we've got all these corporations that are in charge of our food supply. Of course, they're going to be vastly incentivized to get people to overconsume. And the easiest way to do that is to hijack their biology and make the food addictive.
Grow corn, wheat, and soy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can eat a lot of rice and potatoes and not get fat.
How is that? So wait, hold on. It's because they're more complex. Well, I guess rice has a high glycemic index.
They're just whole foods.
Yeah.
They're not inflammatory. Like if you just eat 2 cups of whole wheat, just like a cream of wheat, your stomach's going to be messed up. You wouldn't naturally do that. Like you would just, you'd just be like, this is too much weird fiber. Like this doesn't feel good. Whereas you might eat a couple of cups of rice and just feel great.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the wheat and the corn and the soy that will process and break down, and it's almost like they're sneaking it in.
Yeah.
Because of that profit margin. It's like we can even be eating better carbohydrates, but that's not happening. And the love of carbohydrates is real. I mean, I feel it every day.
Yeah.
But I also know that sometimes I need to have that ice cream. And other times, if I eat the potato or 2 potatoes, that will fulfill that craving or that need that I feel for the glucose. And everything will be a lot better than if I just go off the rails.
Yeah. Well, it's delayed gratification, I guess.
Yes, sir.
One of the things that I did want to touch on was just sort of like simplifying and making it broad strokes. Like if you want to eat for a good blend of performance and longevity, then you should probably be prioritizing healthy animals and maybe some green vegetables and some fruits, and then also allowing yourself to indulge in some carbohydrates. But preferably, it's going to be after either a tiger chased you up a tree or you actually challenged yourself, and like physically in the gym
Perfectly
or in
said.
your sport. Yeah, I exercise is a huge part of my life. It's been a huge part of my life for my entire life. And, every single week, sometimes every single day, there's exercises that I don't want to do and that I kind of like force myself to do. And so like today I had this exercise and I really did not want to go through 4 sets, but that was my goal. That was where I'm at in the program. So I went through all 4 sets and, it wasn't quite getting chased up a tree by a tiger, but at the end, my energy was gone. Like I'd given it away, I'd given it to the exercise.
You have, over the last couple of decades, done a very above average job of training your body to deal with real stimulus in terms of stress and training your mind to take yourself there. There is and I'm not saying that someone should do that or shouldn't. I'm just saying that you can do that. Mm-hmm. But there is a difference between trying hard on even a deadlift and actually taking your body to its limit on that same exercise. Mm-hmm. And I think that it is much more difficult for someone to try to read their way into that intensity versus having been taken there and kind of being able to see that path, or at least traces of it. Mm-hmm. Yes. I think that that's one of the things that makes people who have dealt with traumatic experiences often superior competitors. They're able to tap into that thing that brings them to their potential, whereas other people might aspire to be able to have that intensity, but they're still trying to find it. And a lot of people live their lives ashamed of a trauma or an event that happened to them, but really it was part of their superpower because that gave them the switch to be able to tap into what is their true humanity, whether that's true peace or true aggression. Mm-hmm. And that's valuable when it comes to productivity. I don't know if it's valuable when it comes to longevity, but maybe helping you avoid the lions in the future. Well, but it's definitely valuable in terms of productivity, and it's something that people should be kind of proud of when they're on the other side of.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of value in being able to get uncomfortable. And it's not all suffering, right? Because, if you've experienced trauma, but then you can flip that switch, there's going to be times when you flip that switch that will bring you the greatest joy that you've ever known. Not always, but sometimes, but it's rarely comfortable. It's not going to be comfortable.
No. You got to almost expect it to not be.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. But within the context of this conversation, that gives you the ability to create those deficits that warrant doing things with your nutrition.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. And that's cool, because for somebody who's biohacking or just trying to improve their appearance or improve their diet, like seeing what these foods and these techniques can really do is pretty good stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say I'm excited to implement some of the strategies that we've talked about.
Did you want to touch on the intermittent fasting thing before we wrap it up?
Oh.
Do you have any comments on that research that you had gotten?
Yeah. So recently I sent, and it was only in the last week that this research came out.
Yeah, it's new.
Where they essentially found that they had 2 groups and everybody was overweight, and they randomly assigned one group to an intermittent fasting protocol, and the other group was not. And at the end, they found no benefits to intermittent fasting. And historically, when I've thought about intermittent fasting, I guess, in my simplistic understanding, I was like, well, when I'm fasting, I'm a little bit more predisposed to. Oh, it's so funny. Like looking back on it now, I'm like, well, I'm just in whatever state that I need to be in. But I was thinking that I'm in easier for me to get into a fight or flight state, easier for me to get sympathetic and to get those performances that I need to get. And then when I eat food, it's going to be much easier for me to get into a parasympathetic state. And I can use that by exercising while I'm fasted and then eating a lot of food to sort of control what my body does with those fuels and those nutrients.
Sure.
But
including a big insulin response, very anabolic.
Yeah, for sure. But, from an evolutionary perspective, it would seem that fasting, enduring a state of starvation, essentially, would induce the body to create fat stores and not prioritize holding on to muscle. Like if I'm starving and I'm not surviving because I'm not getting enough food, this muscle is very expensive metabolically. So why am I going to hold on to it? I'm going to create more fat stores. So, and additionally, my understanding is that muscle grows best in an environment of caloric surplus. So did those earlier animal studies that suggested that intermittent fasting helped people preferentially hold on to lean muscle mass and lose body fat, did they miss the mark? What's going on here?
The studies were probably all accurate.
What's your take on did this recent findings, the results, change your thoughts about fasting, or did it kind of fit into the picture for you?
Fits into the picture for me.
Tell me more.
When people have magnificent results with intermittent fasting, it's usually due to it resetting them to some physiological normalcy.
Mm-hmm.
So, as an example, if somebody has a really high sugar diet and they do a bunch of other things wrong, when they start intermittent fasting, one of the things they're doing practically is they're stabilizing their blood sugar for long periods of time. Now, the first couple of days, it's going to be a mess because their hormones are screwed up, mm-hmm. and they're going to be hyper responsive to whatever they eat. And when they're not eating, they're going to be hyper responsive to that. They're mm-hmm. just going to feel up and down and terrible. After a few days, once that settles down, they're going to have a consistent blood sugar. And that is going to have a positive consequence on their testosterone. Surplus of carbohydrates upregulates conversion of estrogen from testosterone mm-hmm. in the liver.
Interesting.
So a man who's eating carbs all day is going to cause themselves relatively high estrogen. And estrogen causes you to add body fat, especially in certain parts of your body. It's actually very good for maintaining your joints, and it's going to make you passive and more emotional. Mm-hmm. So when somebody starts intermittent fasting and all of those factors were out of whack, and they start having a little bit higher testosterone, having a more normal blood sugar, all of a sudden the foods they're eating act in their body more normal, and they're getting signals from the nervous system and their endocrine system to be a more massive person. Mm-hmm. And as we know, by looking at Brazilian martial artists, you can have almost nothing to eat and take a cycle of testosterone and carry a bunch of muscle.
Oh, yeah.
Our endocrine system can dictate our basic musculoskeletal structure much better than diet can.
Wow.
Now, diet and that can take it to the next level, but you can look way above average, basically being deficient in protein in your diet just by manipulating your endocrine system. Mm-hmm. So that's an example of how that would work great. But that person's not going to reach their full potential or their best physique or their most lean state doing the intermittent fasting. They would need to expand the positive practices from that, like not spiking their blood sugar constantly and maintaining insulin sensitivity while adding in more essential nutrients that their body can do things with, like protein and essential fats, stuff like that. And then obviously, but with intermittent fasting, generally people are having carbs during the time they can eat. But so I guess I was just assuming that. But obviously, the other piece of that is that they can use their carbs more productively.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you take you or me and say we're going to do an intermittent fasting experiment, let's put these guys in a room together. We'll give them a bunch of gym equipment and some like movies to watch. We're both our bodies will get worse, relatively speaking, compared to eating perfect nutrition where we're eating throughout the day. Perfect nutrition, right?
Mm-hmm. So where did they go wrong in this study that caused the participants who were on the intermittent fasting to lose more muscle mass than the participants that were on like a regular feeding schedule?
They were probably relatively healthy people.
Mm-hmm.
So let me give you an example of my life. I've done lots of intermittent fasting. People think that I have done intermittent fasting for about a decade, but for the majority of that decade, I always have a liquid breakfast that is fat and protein. For the last years, that's been collagen.
Mm-hmm.
I often wake up before 6 o'clock in the morning because the trading bell is at 6:30.
Mm-hmm.
And I often don't get training in the gym until 8 or 8:30 at night and might be there till like 11. So that's a really long day. That's not every day.
Right.
That's pretty frequently. That's
and
a
that's
long
not
day.
a lot of sleep.
And it's not a lot of sleep and it's not a lot of time to actually eat if I'm trying to put it all into a block.
Right.
I come out of the gym and I eat one thing and the body can only like assimilate so much protein, et cetera, in a given meal. And then I'm just not going to eat till midday, even though I've been up since 5:45 a.m.
Yeah.
And I have put myself through rigorous training. I'm thinking hard, but more importantly, I put myself through rigorous training. I've got little injuries, wear my body out. I am missing out on a lot of opportunity to recover and refuel my muscles versus intermittent fasting. Now, I could intermittent fast. Most likely, I'd gain a little bit more body fat because my cortisol would be up because my body would be stressed out all the time from never getting enough nutrition to recover.
Mm-hmm.
I still wouldn't get obese because I wasn't doing enough. I wasn't eating enough and I was doing too much activity to really gain that weight, but I wouldn't be recovering optimally.
Right.
So it wouldn't be practical for me. You mentioned not enough sleep, malnutrition, too much exercise. The intermittent fasting isn't some secret that's going to all of a sudden turn on something that'll override all of that.
Right. So you use it more strategically.
Yeah. So I just, a lot of times I try to have a meal that keeps me in a fat burning state in the morning so that I have steady energy, but I'm still giving myself nutrition so that I can be recovering while I'm doing that. And so a lot of times that ends up looking like coffee with emulsified fat in it and some collagen. And that's just, again, so that I can keep energy and it's quick, it's practical. I try to do a lot during the day. So, or I might eat eggs, whole eggs, something along those lines. Not because that's such a special meal, but for that purpose, to avoid any carbohydrate spike, any insulin involvement.
Right.
Until I really want to get that system going and I'm good with a little bit of up and down in my energy. But I would assume that the people who did that study did a good job of sticking with the study, and they probably weren't in the worst of ways to begin with. The other thing that I'd be interested in knowing is what was the group's diet that was eating all day. Were they eating healthy food, or were they eating pie? If they were eating healthy food, they might have been on an ideal diet to support what they were doing.
Yeah. I haven't looked into what they were eating, but that's a good point. Yeah,
Right?
and I didn't see any mention of their activity levels.
And they usually leave all that out. They're not.
Yeah.
They're usually not paying attention to that, and then they release the study as the answer.
Right.
But those would be my guesses.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody, say, was just a regular guy working out, going for a little run after work, and he somehow managed to just eat nothing but fish and vegetables 4 or 5 times a day for 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I could even do that, but he's probably going to make some pretty positive physical composition changes in his body.
Yeah.
You know,
you should try it, Patrick. I bet you pull it off.
Regardless of if he's doing it with intermittent fasting or having a breakfast.
Right.
Yeah. That's the impression I get of that. What was your impression?
I didn't really know what to make of it. It was interesting that the study, the number one researcher changed his own dietary habits as a result of what he found, because he'd been intermittent fasting for years,
Yeah.
Had been a big proponent. And he even said that he felt that intermittent fasting worked for him. And he was shocked by the data that didn't support what he had always assumed about it.
That's interesting to me, in that I wonder how broadly he was looking at what worked for him. Like, I wonder if he really did mentally feel his best intermittent fasting. It could have. And I wonder if mentally the results of that study created doubt for him, and it made him like insecure about like gains he may be missing out on, or an ability to stay lean he might be missing out on. And that made him worried.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that also makes me think about is how many of the proponents of intermittent fasting that are athletic figures, like these CrossFit guys and stuff like that, are taking 200 milligrams of testosterone and a bunch of other stuff.
You can advocate whatever you want then.
Right.
Yeah.
No, you can hold on to a lot more muscle that way.
Yeah.
You can get away with a lot and be ahead of people.
Certainly more research needs to be done, right? Like, they should take a group of athletes and they should test them, and they should, they should try to account for a lot more variables than they did. But hey, man, you can't. We're never going to get to the final answer, right? It's all just like hints along the way,
man.
And that's right. That's part of the game, part of the deal.
And like we said in the beginning of this conversation, there are good aspects of fasting. Not that everyone should fast.
Mm-hmm.
Intermittent fasting, day, 3 days, that there are good benefits that don't necessarily have to do with how fat you are. So if somebody's interested in doing a fast or intermittent fasting for some other reason, just because you might not be your leanest that you possibly could, maybe it's still a good thing for you to experiment with. It might be a piece of your happiness puzzle.
Yeah. I'm all about experimentation, for sure.
Me too.
Hey, man, I appreciate you and everything you bring to the table. Thank you so much. I can hear my kids going bananas upstairs, so I should probably
Perfect timing.
Yeah.
All right, dude.
Cool, man.
Great job.
Hey, thanks, brother. You too. We'll talk soon.